It was a Saturday in early October, and finally, the house was quiet. I was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee in my hands, looking at my phone. John, my husband, was away on a business trip, and his son Ben was planning to spend the night at a friend's house. A quiet evening lay ahead. I could finally relax, maybe watch a series or read a book that I had been putting off. Suddenly, my phone vibrated. A message from Ben. "Hey, Sarah. Things didn't work out with friends. I'll be back in half an hour." This surprised me a bit. Ben and I had a relationship that was more polite than close. He never called me mom, only Sarah, and always kept his distance. I never intruded on him with advice, trying to give him space, but this only deepened our estrangement. "No problem. Feel at home," I replied, trying to sound friendly but neutral. And although I wrote this without any particular intention, something inside me stirred. Being alone with Ben always felt a bit strange, as if there was something between us that no one wanted to talk about. 20 minutes later, I heard the door open. The smell of fried chicken filled the air as I was chopping vegetables. I turned around and saw Ben. He came in as usual, in his hoodie and jeans that always hung on him a bit carelessly. "Hey," his voice was quiet but polite. "Do you want to have lunch?" I asked, gesturing to the table. "Yeah, probably," he replied, and I was surprised by his agreement. Usually, he would go straight to his room as soon as he got home. We didn't spend time together, only occasionally exchanging brief phrases. But this time, something was different. We ate in silence, talking only about trivial things: school, weather, his friends. But I felt something strange, inexplicable, as if there was tension in the air that had no explanation. I tried to dismiss these thoughts, but they kept coming back. When we finished, Ben unexpectedly offered to help me clear the table. This surprised me again, but I didn't object. We worked in silence, but I noticed how our hands occasionally touched. Each moment seemed accidental, but every little thing started to mean something to me. It seemed like he suddenly became closer than he was before. "Do you have plans for the rest of the day?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but inwardly, I was tense. "No, nothing special," he replied, leaning against the kitchen counter. "And you?" "I thought about watching a movie," I suggested, struggling to suppress my inner anxiety. "We can watch together if you want." Ben hesitated for a moment, as if considering my offer, and then nodded. "Sounds good." We headed to the living room, and I noticed that the strange feeling of anticipation still hung in the air. I turned on the TV and sat on the couch. Ben settled down next to me, but not too close. However, even at that distance, I could feel his presence, sense his warmth, and it made me a bit nervous. Throughout the movie, I tried to focus on the screen, but I kept catching myself glancing at him out of the corner of my eye. I pretended not to notice, but the tension inside me grew. I couldn't understand what I was feeling. Was it just awkwardness or something deeper? But it wouldn't let go. When the movie ended, I felt a slight relief, as if something complicated had come to an end. But instead of just getting up and leaving, Ben turned to me and quietly said, "Thanks for spending time with me. I really needed it." His words touched something unexpected inside me. "I enjoyed it too," I replied, although my heart started beating faster. This was just a simple exchange, but there was something more in it than ordinary gratitude. At that moment, I realized that something between us had changed. I felt that our conversation and our shared moments meant more than just stepmother and stepson. Something was happening on a level that I hadn't fully realized yet. And although I tried to dismiss these thoughts, they had already taken root deep inside me. A few days passed, and I couldn't get that evening out of my head. What should have been an ordinary day that ended with nothing remarkable had turned into something that changed our interaction with Ben. At first, I tried to convince myself that I was just exaggerating, that it was all just my fantasy, born out of boring evenings alone. But those moments we spent together wouldn't let go of me. I often wondered what would have happened if John had returned home a little later that evening. What if Ben had decided to stay a little longer? It seemed like there was some unspoken tension between us, something that both of us felt, but neither wanted to say out loud. That Tuesday after work, I stopped by the supermarket to buy groceries for dinner. It was my way of coping with stress. Cooking always helped me focus on something specific, especially when my thoughts started to scatter. As I was picking out vegetables, it suddenly occurred to me that Ben would be home again tonight, and for some reason, I felt a sense of excitement. Remembering our recent interaction, I suddenly realized that I was looking forward to continuing those moments. When I got home, Ben was already in the kitchen. He was sitting at the table with his phone in his hands, and a smile flickered across his face when he saw me. This was unusual because he almost never paid attention to me. We exchanged a few words about his day, and I noticed that he was opening up a bit more than usual. "You look tired," he said when I started unpacking the groceries. "Yeah, long day," I replied, gladly feeling that talking to him no longer felt as strained as before. "But cooking always helps me unwind. Want to join?" He unexpectedly agreed, which surprised me a bit. Usually, he wasn't interested in such things, preferring to stay in his room or do his own thing. But this time, something was different. We started cooking dinner together, and I felt that strange, inexplicable tension between us again. It seemed like every shared step, every movement took on special significance. We stood next to each other in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, and our hands occasionally touched. Each touch caused a slight shiver in me, but I tried to stay calm. "You're actually pretty good at this," I said with a smile, trying to steer the conversation to a neutral topic. "Well, I have a good teacher," he replied, and I felt his gaze linger on me longer than necessary. These words made me pause for a moment. I knew I should have just laughed in response and ended the conversation, but something inside me clung to that moment. It seemed like it was a subtle hint, something more than just a friendly compliment. Our eyes met, and at that moment, I realized that we both were fully aware of what was happening. We were standing too close for it to be called a simple coincidence. "Thanks," I said quietly, unable to continue this dialogue. I needed to distract myself, to switch to something else, but I knew there was no escaping it. Dinner was cooking, and when we finally sat down at the table, I still felt the tension hanging between us. We talked about trivial things again, just like that day when we watched the movie, but now every word seemed filled with hidden meaning. I felt my thoughts starting to replay all the moments that had happened over the past few days, but I couldn't understand how to react to it. After dinner, Ben offered to help with the cleanup, which surprised me again. We worked in silence, but I felt him constantly looking at me. At one point, I turned around, and our eyes met. It was strange, almost awkward, but there was something more in that look. Something that made me feel vulnerable and, at the same time, strangely excited. When we finished, I felt exhausted, although the day hadn't been particularly tough. I knew that something inexplicable was unfolding between us, something I couldn't just ignore, but I also understood the danger of these thoughts. I tried to remind myself that he was just my stepson, that this was wrong, that I needed to be careful. But the more I tried to fight it, the stronger the tension became. "I'm going to my room," he said, interrupting my thoughts. There was something quiet in his voice, as if an unconscious expectation. "Okay," I replied, trying to sound as calm as possible. But even when he left, I still felt his presence nearby. Every encounter with him now had its weight, and I knew this was no longer just friendly interaction. Something much more complex was brewing between us, and I had no idea how to deal with it. That night, lying in bed, I tried to find the strength to forget about it. But memories of our glances, touches, hints kept coming back to me. The boundary I had tried to maintain was beginning to blur, and I felt that a little more, and I wouldn't be able to stop it. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy feeling in my heart. I tried to convince myself that everything that happened between Ben and me was not real. It was just my mind blowing things out of proportion. After all, such tension could be temporary, accidental. However, the more I tried to find a rational explanation for my thoughts, the clearer I realized this wouldn't go away on its own. John returned home from his business trip in the evening, and his presence in the house should have brought relief. But I felt even more tense, as if the very idea of him being nearby made every interaction with Ben even sharper. We talked with John about his trip. He asked how my days had been. I told him the standard story: work, household chores, nothing unusual. But somewhere inside, I knew I was hiding something much deeper, although I didn't fully understand what it was. We had dinner together, and I felt the weight of an invisible burden on us. Ben behaved calmly, as always, but his gaze constantly caught mine, and this time I couldn't ignore it. John, however, was too busy with his phone and worked to notice what was happening between us. It was a strange feeling, as if Ben and I existed in some separate space, even when we were in the same room with John. After dinner, John went to his office to work, and Ben stayed in the living room. I tried to busy myself with household chores, but my thoughts kept returning to what was happening between us. I knew I should keep my distance, that this was wrong, to feel anything like this for my stepson. But everything in his behavior, his glances, and his words seemed to be a call to break that boundary. At some point, I sat down next to him in the living room, trying to act as casually as possible. The TV was on, but I barely heard what they were saying. All my focus was on Ben, on his gestures, on how he occasionally caught my gaze. "Sir," he said suddenly, his voice unexpectedly serious. His words cut through my nervousness, making me tense up immediately. "I wanted to talk to you about something." I met his gaze, and at that moment, I realized that there would be no simple conversation. Everything he was about to say was already hanging in the air between us. My heart started beating faster, and I tried to suppress the growing feeling of anxiety. "About what?" I asked, although I already knew the answer. He hesitated, as if choosing his words. The room was quiet. Only the TV in the corner provided background noise. "I don't know how to say this," he began, and his voice sounded as if he too was trying to figure out his own feelings. "But it seems like something has changed between us, and I'm not sure how to deal with it." These words hung in the air, like thunder that had just rumbled. My heart pounded even harder, and I couldn't hide my reaction. I didn't know what to say. Inside me, conflicting emotions battled. One part of me wanted to retreat, to put an end to these strange feelings. But another part felt the pull that I couldn't completely ignore. Then, I tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Suddenly, everything became too real. Too real. We both knew what was happening, but neither of us dared to say it out loud. "I'm not saying this is right," he continued, seeing my confusion. "It's just, I can't ignore it, and it seems like you feel it too." I was silent, not knowing how to respond. This was so wrong, and yet so compelling. I always saw him as John's son, a teenager who just needed attention and support. But now this feeling was changing, and I couldn't find a way to escape it. "We can't," I whispered finally, my voice trembling. "We can't let this happen. It's wrong." Ben looked at me with a seriousness I rarely saw in his eyes. "I know it's difficult," he said, "but you can't deny that something is here." I wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong. But that would be a lie. There really was something between us, and I felt it with every fiber of my being. But I also knew that if we crossed that line, there would be no turning back. "We need to be careful," I said quietly, trying to regain control. "We can't let this go too far." He nodded, but I saw in his face that this decision was no easier for him than it was for me. We both knew that how we behaved from now on would determine a lot. This was a moment when everything could either fall apart or become even more complicated. I stood up, feeling my heart still pounding in my chest. "I need to go," I said, trying to get away from this conversation. But even as I left, I knew it was just a delay of what had to happen. Over the next week, I tried with all my might to return to normal life. John was home, and that should have brought me peace, but I couldn't shake off the tension that had settled inside me. Every interaction with Ben, every accidental encounter in the hallway or kitchen now felt different. Even when John was nearby, I constantly felt Ben. We didn't talk about what had happened, but every glance, every gesture hinted that this conversation was not over. One day, when John went to work again, and Ben was supposed to go to college, I decided to stay home. I had an excuse, working remotely, but in truth, I just couldn't deal with the anxiety that was building up inside me. I knew that something inevitable was approaching, and I couldn't run from it anymore. I was sitting in the kitchen, staring at my laptop screen, when I heard the door open. I was surprised because Ben usually came back much later. My heart skipped a beat when I heard his footsteps in the hallway. "Hey, Sarah." His voice sounded as if he had appeared out of nowhere. I turned around sharply, and he was standing in the kitchen doorway, looking at me with the same serious expression I had seen that evening. Inside me, everything tensed up. I tried to smile, pretending it was an ordinary day. "Hey," I replied, trying to hide the nervousness in my voice. "Why are you back so early?" "Our class was canceled," he replied, still not taking his eyes off me. There was something in his presence that made the air in the room heavy, as if it was filled with something invisible but powerful. "I wanted to talk to you." My heart started beating faster. I already knew that this conversation would not be easy. "Ben, I think we already discussed everything that evening." I tried to maintain my composure, but my voice betrayed me. He took a step towards me, and I felt my thoughts racing in panic.
"No, Sarah. We didn't finish."
"I can't just leave it like that." His insistence was frightening and yet compelling. I should have been strong to hold that boundary that we both had barely not crossed. But with each step he took forward, I felt that boundary becoming more fragile, as if any wrong word could shatter it. "Ben, I don't know what you want me to say." I tried again. "This is wrong. We can't continue." He came closer, and now I could feel his presence as a physical force. My body tensed, but not from fear, rather from that energy that hung between us. "Why are you afraid of this?" His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but there was strength in it that I hadn't expected. "I see how you look at me. You feel it too." "Ben, stop," I said, but my voice was weak. Everything inside me told me that I should leave, get out of this situation, but I couldn't. I was as if paralyzed by his words, his closeness. He came even closer, and now there was almost no distance between us. I felt his breath on my skin, and every nerve in my body trembled with tension. "You can't deny this," he continued, and his hand gently touched mine. That was all it took to break the remnants of my resistance. I closed my eyes, trying to suppress the wave of guilt and fear that washed over me. "We can't do this," I repeated, but now my words seemed empty, as if I had already lost this battle. "Why?" he asked again, his voice insistent, but there was something else in it. Something deep, vulnerable. "Why are you afraid?" I opened my eyes and looked at him. In his eyes was the same sincerity I had seen that evening. And at that moment, I realized that I could no longer turn back. This was more than just physical attraction. This was something much deeper, something I had never allowed myself to acknowledge. My hand trembled when I felt his fingers gently touch mine. My body, betraying my mind, responded to this gesture. I knew I shouldn't have allowed this to happen, but at that moment, everything inside me screamed that this was the only thing that made sense. My hand trembled as I felt his fingers gently touch mine. My body, betraying my mind, responded to this gesture. I knew I shouldn't have allowed this to happen, but at that moment, everything inside me screamed that this was the only thing that made sense. I closed my eyes, hoping that this would stop the growing feeling of passion, but instead, it only intensified my sensitivity to each of his touches. His fingers slowly slid under my shirt, my skin burning under his palms. I shivered, trying to maintain the last remnants of control, but when his lips gently touched my neck, I could no longer fight it. My hands instinctively reached out to him, wrapping around his shoulders. I felt him getting closer, and my barriers, which I had been building all these days, collapsed with a dull thud. He whispered my name, and this soft sound made me shiver, as if I had been struck by lightning. Every kiss, every gentle touch made me forget about reality, about who we were, and what we shouldn't be doing. I felt his lips move lower down my neck, and my hands instinctively tightened on his shoulders, as if trying to find a point of support. His breath was hot, his movements confident but careful, and I realized that I could no longer stop this. Our bodies moved in sync, as if obeying a single rhythm that we both had long felt but never allowed ourselves to follow. When our lips met again, I felt him press me closer to him. The silence in the room became deafening, every sound amplified, and I heard how heavily and quickly we both breathed. My skin was on fire, as if every cell of my body craved his touch. His hands moved slowly, almost exploring me, and I was overwhelmed by the feeling that all this was both unreal and inevitable. His hands slid over my body, and at some point, I stopped thinking about what would happen next, stopped trying to resist. I just allowed myself to be here, in this moment, forgetting about everything. When his body pressed against mine, I felt the remnants of my reason dissolve in the growing whirlwind of emotions and desires. This was more than just physical closeness. This was the culmination of those feelings that I'd been trying to suppress for too long. Every touch, every breath seemed to me like the last nail in the coffin of my former world. I knew that after this, everything would change, that we could no longer return to what was before. But at that moment, when our bodies merged in a single movement, I stopped thinking about it. I allowed myself to dissolve in sensations, giving free rein to those feelings that I had been trying to suppress for so long. When it was all over, I realized the weight of what I had done. My heart was pounding wildly, and my breath was ragged. I stepped back, feeling the wave of reality wash over me. Then, I couldn't find the words. Everything inside me screamed that I had made a huge mistake. This was wrong, but words had no meaning. It had already happened. He looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw something more than just passion. It was the look of someone who was seeking something more, understanding, attachment, connection. And I knew that, despite all our conversations about how we should stop, this connection had already been established. "We can't hide this anymore," he said, and I felt my world beginning to crumble. I nodded, unable to resist anymore. I knew we had crossed a boundary that we should never have violated. Now the consequences would be inevitable. I sat in my bedroom, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts swirling in my head like an endless whirlpool. What had I done? How could I have allowed this to happen? In my heart, there was a heaviness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that now everything would be different. The world around seemed the same house, the same things. But I felt that something irreversible had happened inside me. I had broken that boundary that I had promised myself never to cross. Then, his touches still lingered on my skin, his words still echoed in my ears. I thought about how this was possible, how I could have allowed myself to go so far. But what next? How to live with what had happened? Could I return to a normal life, pretend that nothing had happened? Deep down, I knew the answer was no. This couldn't just be forgotten. This couldn't just be swept under the rug. We both were no longer who we were before. I asked myself a million questions, and I couldn't find an answer to any of them. How had I allowed myself to get entangled in my own feelings? Why hadn't I stopped it at the moment when there was still a chance? Or maybe I just didn't want to. Were those boundaries real, or did they exist only in my head to protect me from my own desires? And what now? How could I look John in the eye, live under the same roof with Ben, knowing what had happened? Could I continue to pretend that everything was under control? Or would we have to confess what had happened and destroy everything around us? I thought about what morality is. We all live by rules that society dictates to us, but what to do when those rules go against what we feel? Where is that line between what is right and what just seems right? What to do when desires turn out to be stronger than principles? And, in the end, what would I say to myself? What would I say to those who would be drawn into this tangle? I didn't know. But perhaps these are questions that everyone must answer for themselves. How far are we willing to go for what we consider real? And how can we live with the consequences when that step has already been taken?